October 20th, 1943. 0617 hours. The upper slopes of the volcano line carried a cold, uneven wind that rolled across the broken shale as if pushed by an unseen hand. The gusts came in short, sharp pulses that shifted direction without pattern. The ridge lay 520 meters north of an Allied patrol route, and German sentries had held it for 3 days. Their position overlooked a narrow valley, a natural choke point that every advancing unit needed to cross. Several attempts to clear the ridge had failed because each shot fired by Allied marksmen drifted off course in the unpredictable current. A single missed round alerted the defenders, and their return fire pinned down any movement in the open ground below. The wind destroyed precision. Doctrine could not correct it. Every table, every standardized adjustment, broke down on this ridge because the air currents curved around the slopes in ways no manual had ever predicted. Private Alistair Finch studied this problem with the quiet intensity of a man who saw patterns that others dismissed. He crouched behind a rock shelf, his rifle steady, his eyes sweeping across the jagged layer of shale that gave the ridge its uneven texture. Finch was 28, lean with a narrow jaw and sharp focus developed long before the war. He spoke little. Men around him understood him as the sort of soldier who measured twice and acted once. Before he joined the army, he worked as a meteorological assistant at a small regional airport that sat between two low hills. Pilots relied on him because he could read short-distance wind patterns that shifted during takeoffs. He learned how terrain pushed air upward, downward, or sideways. He learned how wind tunneled between slopes even on calm days. That knowledge stayed with him as the war moved across North Africa, Sicily, and now Italy. He arrived at the front believing that marksmanship was only half the job. The other half was understanding the air around the bullet. Most soldiers used fixed charts to estimate wind drift. Finch watched those charts fail again and again on the mountainous ridges of Italy. A valley gust that hit a bullet from the right pushed it left. A sudden updraft from heated rock lifted a round near the ridgeline. Each shift ruined accuracy. Finch observed that the ridge north of their position produced a specific pattern. The gusts came low from the left for 4 or 5 seconds, paused, then returned with a slight upward push. It happened every few minutes. He learned this by watching loose fabric tied to broken fence posts, by tracking dust movements on the rock, and by studying how smoke from small fires bent across the ridge. These observations led him to build a tool that other soldiers mocked. Using a small strip of weighted cloth, 2 nails, and a discarded piece of shingle, he created a simple wind indicator that he mounted on the left side of his rifle. The cloth streamer moved with each gust, but its angle relative to the carved marks on the shingle allowed Finch to estimate wind drift in degrees. It was crude, but it matched the sort of field equipment he used before the war. In the airport job, he had built improvised indicators to help pilots identify crosswind shifts. He applied the same logic to his rifle. His comrades laughed at the idea. They called it unnecessary and odd. They preferred the standard method, using sight adjustments based on general estimates. They trusted the charts. Finch trusted the ridge. The Volturno line made his case stronger each day. German sentries fired from elevated positions that gave them an unobstructed view of any Allied patrol moving across the narrow valley. 3 sentries controlled the ridge, and their fire halted many attempts at reconnaissance. They moved between cracks in the shale that provided small firing slits. Their accuracy came from stable ground and protected angles. Finch watched several Allied marksmen attempt shots from 300 to 500 meters, only to miss by wide margins. The wind did not shift randomly. It only seemed random because no one measured it the way Finch did. On the morning of October 20th, the patrol moved toward the valley floor again. They needed to cross the narrow stretch to chart German artillery positions beyond the ridge. The sky carried a dull gray cover that filtered the sunlight enough to cool the ground. Cold rock changed wind flow, making the currents sharper and faster. As the patrol reached the first cover line near a fallen tree, the ridge erupted with rifle fire. One man went down immediately, struck near the shoulder. Another barely ducked behind the trunk before a second round slammed into the bark. The patrol leader signaled for silence, but the ridge dominated the angle. They had no way forward. Radio requests for mortar fire risked revealing their location. Movement in the open would result in more casualties. Finch crawled to a shallow depression near the tree line. His commanding officer looked at him with a mix of frustration and desperation. Conventional attempts had failed. Doctrine offered no solution in this terrain. The officer gave Finch a single nod, a reluctant approval earned not through rank but through failure of every other option. Finch adjusted the small fabric streamer on his improvised wind sight. He watched as the gust dragged it to the right then lifted it slightly. He counted seconds. He waited. His breathing slowed. The men around him whispered for quiet, sensing that something unorthodox was about to unfold. The ridge sat at an angle that required Finch to account for elevation as well as wind. He dialed his sight in small increments, not following manual guidelines but adjusting based on patterns he had observed over several days. He felt the ground. Cold rock under his glove told him the updraft would be weak in the next few minutes. He glanced at a thin line of dust that curled along the ridge, a visual cue that confirmed his assessment. The streamer shifted again. It held steady for 2 seconds. That alignment told Finch the wind had entered its predictable pause. He exhaled. Then he fired. The shot cracked across the valley in a clean, controlled burst of sound. The bullet arced slightly left, then corrected as the gust weakened. A faint jerk of movement behind a shale outcrop confirmed the hit. The first sentry dropped. The patrol stayed silent, stunned that a single round had cut through the wind pattern that had defeated so many trained marksmen. Finch did not pause to celebrate. He recalibrated instantly, tracking a new gust that began to build. The fabric lifted higher, signaling increased vertical push. Finch adjusted downward, compensating for a small updraft that would form where the ridge heated under fading sunlight. He fired again. A second target collapsed into the crack between the rocks. The ridge went quiet for a moment, then a third shot rang out from the enemy position, rushed and inaccurate. Finch read the last gust, noticing a shift in airflow caused by the earlier shots disturbing loose shale. It created a brief downward curl. Few would have noticed. Finch expected it. He waited for the gust to weaken, then fired the third round. The final sentry fell. The ridge lost its hold on the valley. The ridge fell silent after the third shot, and the patrol exhaled in a slow wave of relief. The valley, which had trapped units for days, finally opened. The men moved forward with deliberate caution, expecting hidden riflemen or a secondary defense line, but no more fire came from the ridge. Finch stayed behind the tree line for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the cloth strip attached to his rifle. The streamer settled. The gust cycle changed. The brief stability that allowed his 3 shots had already ended. Any delay of even 10 seconds would have shifted the angles enough to force a miss. The men around him understood that only one person on the line could have made those shots under those conditions. They understood that his improvised method, mocked only hours earlier, had changed the course of the patrol. The officer signaled the advance. Finch joined the movement, stepping carefully over uneven stones and patches of brittle grass. The patrol climbed the ridge in a wide arc to avoid exposed routes. When they reached the sentry positions, they saw the narrow slits carved into the shale. Each slit gave a clear downward angle into the valley. Each firing position had excellent cover. The Germans had built these points to survive bombardment and stop movement along the approach path. The men studied the angles and saw how the unpredictable wind complicated counterfire. They understood how many lives the sentries could have taken if they remained uncontested. Finch observed the positions in silence. He noted how dust moved around the cracks and how the wind curled against the rock edges. His accuracy came from recognizing these signs long before he fired a single shot. The patrol secured the ridge and established a temporary observation post. They found spent casings, food tins, a field telephone, and a small map marked with range lines into the valley. The Germans had prepared their defense well. Their accuracy was not luck. It came from stable ground and clear fields of fire. The wind crippled Allied shots but did not affect the Germans as severely because their firing angles were reinforced by the rock structure around them. Finch understood that the problem was not enemy superiority but environmental disadvantage. Solving that problem required a different skill set, one most soldiers did not possess. As the men inspected the ridge, Finch remained focused on the sky. He studied the cloud layer and the cold air rising from the shadowed slope. He knew that temperature changes altered wind patterns across mountainous terrain. His past work taught him that even a single degree shift could create a new updraft. While others saw only gray clouds and scattered brush, Finch saw invisible lines of pressure moving through the landscape. It was the same attention he once used to warn pilots about sudden crosswinds before takeoff. In peacetime he prevented accidents. In war he saved lives by eliminating threats. The officer approached Finch. His tone carried a controlled mix of curiosity and acknowledgement. He asked how the device worked. Finch explained the weighted fabric, the angle markings, and how the movement of the strip matched the wind cycles of the ridge. He described the gust patterns he observed. He explained how the wind split around the central rock formation, creating short intervals of relative calm. These intervals were the only moments when a long-range shot had any chance of success. Finch timed his shots to these intervals. He trusted observation over doctrine. The officer listened without interrupting. Other soldiers gathered, trying to understand how such a simple tool could solve a problem that had stopped entire squads. News of Finch's success moved quickly through the nearby units. Soldiers who previously mocked the wind sight now asked him to show them how it worked. Finch demonstrated the movements of the cloth and the corresponding adjustments. Some men tried to copy it using torn rations bags or loose fabric from worn jackets. Others asked Finch how to read dust flow and cloud movement. Finch explained the basics, but he emphasized that each ridge had its own micro-pattern. No universal method existed. The land dictated the rules. His tool only amplified what he already knew from years of studying wind behavior. As the day progressed, Allied forces used the advantage gained from clearing the ridge to push farther along the approach routes. They positioned scouts to monitor German activity on the higher slopes. Mortar teams recalibrated their firing angles based on the new observation point. The removal of the sentries did not end the danger, but it removed a barrier that had blocked progress for days. Finch watched the officers review maps, adjusting plans around the newly accessible terrain. His contribution remained unspoken, but the change in behavior around him revealed the shift in perception. He was no longer the quiet soldier with a strange attachment on his rifle. He was the man whose innovation cleared a ridge that doctrine could not. Later that afternoon, the battalion headquarters requested a detailed account of the engagement. Finch was brought to a small command shelter near a cluster of tents. Inside, officers studied elevation maps and marked wind patterns based on Finch's observations. They asked him to explain how he predicted gusts. Finch clarified that prediction was not the correct term. He did not predict. He observed. He understood that the mountain created repeating patterns. He recognized the shapes of airflow the same way a trained mechanic recognized engine problems by sound. His skill came from constant exposure to wind behavior before the war. Soldiers rarely trained to notice such detail. Finch noticed it by habit. One officer asked if his device could be standardized. Finch replied that the concept could be taught, but every ridge, valley, and slope produced different airflow. His tool worked because it measured real-time movement, not theoretical data from a chart. Another officer asked if Finch could build more sites. Finch said yes. The materials were simple. Scrap shingle, cloth, nails, and carved markings. He could build several in a few hours. But teaching men to read them required more time. The officers approved his request to construct additional wind sites for trial use across sniper teams and reconnaissance units. That evening, Finch returned to the ridge with 2 soldiers who wanted to practice using the device. He tied a fresh cloth strip to a spare rifle and marked the angles on a flat piece of shingle. He demonstrated how to hold the rifle steady and observe subtle changes in airflow. The men struggled at first. One misread a gust. The other misjudged the angle entirely. Finch told them that understanding wind required patience. The land never rushed. Men rushed. That was why they missed. They practiced until nightfall, watching the cloth flicker in the fading light. Night settled over the ridge with a thin chill that crept through uniforms and gear. The valley darkened first, its floor turning into a wide band of shadow, then the slopes followed as the last gray light drained from the sky. Finch remained near the observation post, reviewing the movements of the cloth streamer under low visibility. Even without sunlight, slight airflow shifts still revealed themselves. The strip pulled left when colder air rolled down the higher slope. It lifted when warmer pockets drifted upward from exposed stone. Finch noted these signs, storing them the way he once memorized routine wind reports back at the airport. 2 soldiers watched him work, trying to see what he saw, but the details remained invisible to them. Finch instructed them to listen for the soft rustle of grass that indicated a downward gust. He told them to pay attention to how small stones rolled a few inches in sudden wind shifts. Their eyes widened as they realized that signals surrounded them. They simply never learned how to interpret them. After the training session, Finch returned to the small camp where the patrol had set up temporary shelters. A narrow fire burned low, providing controlled warmth without giving away their position. Soldiers gathered around the flame, speaking in quiet tones. They reviewed the events of the day. Some replayed the moment Finch fired his shots, trying to understand how he had timed the wind so precisely. Others discussed how doctrine failed in mountainous terrain. Finch listened without offering commentary. He had no interest in claiming credit. His mind drifted back to earlier missions, times when wind ruined attempts to neutralize key enemy shooters. Those failures left a permanent mark on him. He wanted no celebration, only improvement. A senior sergeant approached Finch and handed him a small ration tin. The gesture meant acknowledgement from a man who rarely complimented anyone. The sergeant asked Finch for more details about his method. Finch explained the basics again. The sergeant nodded slowly. He said the army trained men to shoot, not to read the land. He said Finch was the first to combine both fields with equal focus. He added that war rewarded those who adapted. Finch appreciated the words, but he maintained his steady demeanor. He did not allow approval or praise to distract him from the ongoing mission. The ridge was only one obstacle. More wind-swept positions awaited throughout the Italian campaign. Later that night, the unit received a message from battalion headquarters. They wanted Finch to provide an extended analysis by morning. Officers planned to brief several companies on the wind behavior typical of the region. They hoped that Finch's experience could help reduce casualties in upcoming engagements. The message proved that his actions on the ridge carried weight far beyond his patrol. His success had reached command levels that usually ignored field improvisations. Finch agreed to the briefing. He knew that sharing knowledge could prevent mistakes that would cost lives. Before sleeping, Finch sat alone on a low rock shelf facing the valley. He traced the shape of the ridge with his eyes, following the breaks and edges that had guided the wind earlier. He imagined how different the air current would be once morning sunlight warmed the stone. He pictured the dust patterns shifting. He pictured the airflow from the higher slopes descending at dawn. These visualizations came naturally to him. He had done similar exercises during his airport days when he forecasted short bursts of crosswind for pilots who trusted his judgment. That trust prepared him for the responsibility he now carried. Morning arrived with sharp clarity. The sky opened in a pale blue gradient that reflected off the cold stone. Finch stood at the front of a makeshift briefing space. Several officers and non-commissioned officers gathered. They held notebooks and looked at Finch with a directness that surprised him. Few enlisted men addressed officers at length, but Finch's insights held practical value. The war demanded solutions, not hierarchy. Finch explained how microclimates differed from the predictable patterns described in training manuals. He described how wind flowed around curved terrain and how valleys created alternating gust cycles. He showed how small cloth indicators translated movement into measurable drift. He demonstrated the device. The cloth swayed gently. He told them that each angle was not absolute. It represented a relationship between gust strength and bullet drift at specific ranges. He showed them how dust trails followed invisible wind lines. He pointed out how the slope behind them, still cold from the night, lowered airflow and created a temporary calm period. Officers asked questions about distance, timing, and firing windows. Finch answered each one with precision, never oversimplifying. The room quieted as the listeners realized the depth of his understanding. The knowledge was not theoretical. It was lived. After the briefing, officers divided soldiers into smaller groups for field demonstrations. Finch guided several marksmen to the western slope where early gusts formed distinct patterns. He instructed them to watch the grass bend and the dust move. He asked them to track how the cloth strip angled downward when a cold pocket of air rolled across the ridge. Some soldiers grasped the concept quickly. Others needed repeated examples. Finch remained patient. He knew that learning wind behavior required practice and repetition. It could not be mastered in hours. But even small progress mattered. Each soldier who understood wind better reduced the risk of unnecessary casualties. By midday, Finch had built 13 additional wind sites using materials gathered from scrap piles. The devices varied slightly because the available pieces of shingle and cloth differed in size. Finch reviewed each one to ensure the markings matched the cloth's movement. Soldiers carried them with a mix of curiosity and caution. Some believed the tool would become essential. Others considered it situational. Finch expected mixed reactions. Innovation rarely achieved immediate acceptance. The battlefield tested ideas. Only repeated success solidified them. In the afternoon, a forward observer reported that German forces had shifted positions along the next ridge. They had fortified a small bunker that overlooked two approach paths. The wind along that ridge moved faster and more erratically than the one Finch had cleared. Regular sniper fire would be risky. Officers reviewed maps and debated whether to call for heavy artillery. But they feared exposing their new positions. After discussions, they asked Finch to evaluate the ridge. He agreed. He knew that if the bunker remained operational, Allied advances would slow again. He prepared his rifle and 2 improvised sights. The patrol set out toward the new observation point. The terrain changed as they approached the second ridge. The rock layers angled more sharply. The wind struck them harder, pushing dust across the ground in long, thin trails. Finch observed the trails closely. He saw how they broke into spirals near specific rock edges. He noted where the wind gained speed. He understood that this ridge required different timing. The wind sight alone would not solve the problem unless he studied the ridge thoroughly. He requested 1 hour of uninterrupted observation. The officer approved the request. The patrol formed a low perimeter while Finch began his analysis. Finch crouched near a narrow ledge and placed a thin strip of cloth on a short nail driven into a piece of shingle. He set it in the dirt a few feet ahead of him. He wanted to observe how the cloth behaved when anchored to the ground rather than the rifle. He repeated this with a second strip at a slightly different height. The two indicators reacted differently when gusts swept across the ridge. The lower cloth angled sharply to the right, while the higher one lifted before dipping downward. Finch recognized this as a layered wind effect. Airflow closer to the ground pushed horizontally, while air passing over the ridge dipped downward due to turbulence. This pattern made long-range shots difficult because a bullet would pass through multiple wind layers before reaching a target. Finch narrowed his eyes and watched the cloth strips undulate with the rhythm of the terrain. The patrol waited behind scattered rocks and shrubs. They spoke in low voices, checking equipment and reviewing their route. They trusted Finch to interpret the ridge. They knew that every failed attempt to remove enemy shooters increased the risk of casualties. Finch continued to track the airflow. He counted seconds between gusts. He measured the length of pauses. He noted how the dust trails split in two near a jagged outcrop, then rejoined farther down. He traced the path of each swirl in the dirt. These patterns told him that the terrain forced the wind to follow a repeating cycle shaped by the ridge's structure. Once he recognized the cycle, he could work within it. Finch shifted slightly to the left to gain a better view. He studied the bunker placement. The Germans had chosen a strong position with wide visibility into both approach paths. The bunker had a narrow firing slit reinforced with stone. The defenders inside would be protected against small arms fire. Only a precise, well-timed shot could disable the shooters. Finch knew that conventional attempts would fail as long as the wind remained unstable. He needed to determine the exact window when the gust cycle weakened enough to permit a clean shot. He observed the strips again. The lower cloth swung right for 3 seconds, paused for 1, then drifted left in a weaker motion. The upper cloth lifted for 4 seconds and dropped sharply for 2. Finch compared the timings. The two cycles overlapped at one narrow point where both gusts weakened. That overlap created a brief moment of stability lasting barely half a second. That was the firing window. Finch exhaled slowly. He understood that the shot required total precision. The timing had to align perfectly. He also understood that the window might change if the cloud cover shifted or if warmer air rose from the valley. After completing his observations, Finch returned to the patrol. He explained the gust behavior in straightforward terms. The men listened intently. Some tried to follow his reasoning, but the concept of layered wind cycles felt unfamiliar. Finch did not expect them to internalize it on the first explanation. He told them what mattered most. There was one narrow opening. If he fired during that opening, the shot had a chance to reach the bunker's firing slit accurately. If he fired outside that window, the bullet would drift off course. The officer nodded and prepared the patrol for a quiet relocation toward a firing position. The men crawled across the rocky ground, using shallow depressions for cover. They reached a natural stone shelf that offered a stable base for Finch to set up his rifle. Finch positioned himself behind a small boulder. He adjusted the improvised sight. He aligned the cloth. He ignored the chatter of distant machine gun bursts echoing from another sector. His focus narrowed to the strips. He needed to verify that the two gust cycles still aligned. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Lift. Drop. The patterns repeated. The window remained. Finch prepared for the shot. He dialed his scope adjustments with short, precise movements. He accounted for distance, elevation, drift, and the layered airflow. He steadied his breathing. He knew that his entire calculation depended on a half-second of stable air. The officer beside him held up a hand to silence the men. The bunker remained quiet. The Germans inside had not detected the patrol. Finch watched the cloth strips. The low strip angled right. The high strip lifted. The moment approached. The strips aligned. Finch fired. The round cut through the air in a shallow arc, passing through the brief window of stability. The recoil pushed into his shoulder, but he held steady. The sound echoed across the ridge. For a moment nothing moved. Then a faint metallic clatter came from the bunker's firing slit. The first target had been hit. The Germans reacted instantly. A burst of rifle fire sprayed from the slit. The rounds struck the stones around the patrol. The men hugged the ground. Finch remained calm. He observed how the wind shifted after the shot. Disturbed dust swirled upward, altering the cycle for several seconds. He needed the airflow to return to its original rhythm before he attempted a second shot. The bunker remained active. The position had not been fully neutralized. Finch watched the strips reset. The cycles regained structure. The patrol waited for Finch's signal. Men clenched their jaws. They knew that each second exposed them to danger. Finch counted the gust timing again. He needed confirmation. The low strip angled right. The high strip lifted. The overlap neared. He adjusted his scope slightly downward to compensate for the wind's altered return pattern. He exhaled. Then he fired a second round. A sharp thud sounded from the bunker. The firing slit went silent. The men exchanged quick glances. But Finch did not relax. He knew at least one more defender might remain inside. He continued to observe the airflow. He waited until the pattern stabilized fully. The strips aligned again. He fired a third shot using the same rigid timing. The bunker remained silent. No return fire emerged. The officer sent 2 soldiers forward in a low crawl. They approached carefully using the terrain for cover. After a tense minute, they signaled all clear. The bunker crew had been neutralized. Finch's 3 shots had broken the defensive position that controlled 2 vital approach paths. The patrol advanced and secured the ridge. As the soldiers inspected the bunker, they found rifles, ammunition crates, and a small spotting scope. The defenders had been monitoring the valley for any Allied movement. Their vantage point made them dangerous. Removing them allowed Allied troops to reposition without constant threat. Soldiers walked through the bunker with quiet respect for the precision required to neutralize it. They understood how difficult the shots had been. Finch stood outside the bunker, watching the wind move across the ridge. The strips fluttered again, falling out of alignment. The stability window closed. Finch realized how narrow and fragile that moment had been. Without patient observation, the shots would have failed. The patrol held the ridge while engineers marked approach routes and communication lines. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher. Heat changed everything. Gusts that had been sharp and rhythmic in the morning softened into long, uneven pushes across the ridge. Finch stayed near the stone shelf, studying the new pattern. The cloth strips behaved differently now. They drifted with slow, irregular motions. The rhythm he used for the bunker shots no longer existed. This confirmed his belief that each engagement required fresh observation. No single formula applied across changing temperatures. Soldiers who relied only on manuals would never understand why their shots drifted. Finch knew the answer rested in the land, not in doctrine. The officer joined him again. He asked if the new conditions would help or hinder future shots. Finch replied that the warmer air created unpredictable swells. Midday wind was unsuitable for precise fire. The officer accepted the explanation. He instructed the patrol to maintain the ridge but avoid unnecessary engagements until conditions improved. The men settled into defensive positions and monitored the surrounding area. Finch remained alert. He wanted to understand how the airflow evolved throughout the day. Each change provided new information he could use later. As hours passed, word of Finch's success spread beyond the immediate sector. Messengers arrived requesting a field demonstration for marksmen from other companies. Finch agreed. He believed that sharing knowledge strengthened the entire front. The more soldiers understood the environment, the fewer lives would be lost. He led the visitors to a section of the ridge where the wind had developed a slow rolling pattern. He explained how heat rising from the stones created vertical disturbances. He pointed out how each disturbance altered bullet paths. The marksmen listened with focused attention. Some tested their rifles, adjusting based on Finch's observations. Their shots landed closer to the intended impact points, confirming the value of the method. One of the visiting sergeants asked Finch how he identified the exact firing window earlier. Finch clarified that he did not predict the gusts. He observed the pattern until it repeated. He counted the cycles. He matched the cycle to the cloth's movement. He timed his breathing to the calm period. He emphasized that precision came from discipline, patience, and observation, not guesswork. The sergeant nodded. He said that people underestimated the role of environmental knowledge in long-range shooting. Finch agreed quietly. By late afternoon, headquarters sent another request. They wanted Finch to meet with a liaison officer responsible for coordinating sniper operations along several ridgelines. Finch walked to the command tent with steady composure. Inside, maps covered the tables. Lines marked enemy strong points. Notes described failed attempts to suppress those positions. The liaison officer greeted Finch and asked him to describe the wind site in detail. Finch placed the device on the table. He explained each component. He showed how the cloth responded to specific gust strengths. He described how the markings translated into wind drift adjustments. The officer examined the device and asked if it could be standardized for production. Finch replied that the core concept could be standardized, but the markings would vary based on rifle type and cloth weight. The Army could produce a general version, but soldiers would still need to understand local wind behavior. The liaison officer asked Finch if he would be willing to help test a refined prototype. Finch nodded. He knew the trial could improve accuracy across multiple units. The officer drafted a quick authorization. Finch was now part of a small effort to integrate field innovation into broader strategy. The patrol returned to camp near dusk. The sky turned a muted orange. Long shadows stretched across the valley. Finch checked the cloth strips again. The cooling air changed the gusts. The patterns grew sharper. The valley pulled colder wind upward, creating short bursts that matched the early morning rhythm. Finch recognized the cycle. He understood how the airflow evolved throughout the entire day. The knowledge strengthened his confidence. He began recording the sequences in a small notebook. He documented the timings, the temperature shifts, and the expected stability windows. The information would become valuable for future engagements. After the evening meal, the men gathered around a dim lantern. They reviewed the day's events. Some joked about earlier doubts they had about Finch's device. Others reflected on how his actions saved lives. Finch listened but said little. He preferred to let results speak. The officer announced that headquarters had submitted a formal commendation for Finch. The men nodded with approval. Finch looked down for a moment, then returned his attention to the ridge. His priority remained understanding the wind for the next mission. As night deepened, the wind settled into a steady, predictable pattern. Finch spent another hour tracking it, memorizing the new rhythm. The stars appeared above the ridge. The silence carried weight. Finch felt the burden of expectation pressing in. Soldiers now depended on his knowledge. That responsibility felt heavier than the rifle on his shoulder. But he accepted it. He knew that innovation carried risk. He knew that once a soldier demonstrated a new method, the Army relied on it. The next morning, the battalion prepared for a renewed push along the northern approach. Reports indicated German forces had established new sentry points along another series of ridges. The terrain resembled the earlier two positions but had steeper angles. Command wanted Finch to evaluate the new location before any attack. They escorted him to the forward line. Finch surveyed the terrain. He identified three main gust channels that cut across the slope. He noticed how the wind split near a tall boulder, creating two conflicting currents. He studied the dust patterns. He examined the brush movements. He identified the exact moments when air pressure shifted. Officers asked if accurate shots were possible. Finch replied that they could be, but the firing windows were narrower. He explained that the gust cycles followed a compound rhythm due to the terrain. He requested time to build two new indicators with different cloth weights. The officers agreed. Finch gathered small materials from discarded gear. He cut cloth strips. He carved new markings. He placed the indicators at different points on the ridge. He observed them. He documented the cycles. During these observations, a young private approached Finch. He asked how Finch knew where to place the indicators. Finch replied that placement depended on the wind's interaction with terrain. He told the private to watch the brush. He pointed out how the leaves moved differently near the boulder. He showed how the dust swirled behind a low ridge. The private tried to replicate the observation but struggled. Finch reassured him. He told him that understanding would come with repeated exposure. As the cycles aligned, Finch recorded the final pattern in his notebook. He told the officer that he could take the shot when needed. The officer nodded. The upcoming push depended on Finch neutralizing the sentries controlling the higher ridge. Soldiers prepared for the maneuver with renewed confidence. They trusted Finch's method. They trusted his judgment. They knew that innovation outweighed rigid doctrine in this terrain. The push toward the higher ridge began at 0610 hours. The air carried a cold bite that sharpened as the sun rose behind the eastern slope. Finch positioned himself behind a cluster of stones that formed a natural firing rest. Two sentries occupied narrow cuts in the rock near the crest. Their vantage point overlooked both approach routes and the valley floor. Their accuracy pinned down several Allied elements the previous day. Neutralizing them was essential. Finch reviewed his indicators one final time. The lighter cloth swung quickly in the lower gust channel. The heavier cloth moved in slower arcs near the upper flow. The two rhythms overlapped at a single point. Finch counted each cycle with steady focus. He understood that the firing window lasted less than a second. The men behind him waited without speaking. They trusted that. Finch saw what they could not. The gust hit. The lighter cloth angled right. The heavier cloth pulled upward. Finch prepared. The overlap neared. The wind paused. He fired. The shot traveled through the comm pocket before the gust returned. A fragment of dust burst inside the sentry slit. The figure dropped. The ridge reacted with scattered fire. Rounds struck stones near Finch, sending shards across his sleeves. He ignored the impact and recalibrated. The gust cycle shifted slightly after the first shot. He watched the cloth strips reset. The heavier cloth dipped more sharply. The lighter cloth delayed by a full second. Finch adjusted his scope by a narrow margin. He waited again for alignment. The second window formed. He fired. The remaining sentry fell. The ridge went quiet. Officers signaled the advance. Soldiers moved up the slope and controlled formation. They secured the position and identified additional firing slits carved into the rock. The defenders had prepared a layered defense designed to slow the Allied approach. Without Finch's timing, the position would have cost lives. The men studied the terrain with new awareness. They recognized how the wind shaped the battlefield. They understood why earlier attempts failed. Finch's method offered clarity that doctrine never provided. Command received news of the success within minutes. They marked the ridge as cleared and redirected units toward the western pass. Word of Finch's precision spread through nearby companies. Some viewed him as a specialist. Others considered him an anomaly the army rarely produced. Finch took no part in the discussions. He remained near the ridge and recorded the final gust pattern. He knew that the Italian mountains would present similar challenges repeatedly. His notes would help future patrols. Later that evening, the battalion commander met Finch at the forward post. He acknowledged the value of Finch's actions. He said that the wind sight had prevented unnecessary losses. He added that formal recognition would follow after the coming operations. Finch stood quietly, hands folded behind his back. He appreciated the acknowledgement but felt no pride. His mind remained fixed on the next ridge, the next gust cycle, the next narrow window where a single shot could alter the outcome. As night settled, Finch walked away from the camp and sat on a low outcrop overlooking the valley. The wind moved across the terrain in long, cold waves. He listened to it. He studied its rhythm. He understood that war punished rigid thinking. Survival depended on those who adapted. His simple device, built from scrap, had forced the army to reconsider how it approached long-range fire in complex terrain. His contribution would not appear in manuals or official reports in the near future. But the soldiers who advanced safely because of his method understood its worth. He watched the cloth strip flicker in the darkening wind. The movement told him everything he needed to know. It showed the land's pulse. It revealed danger before men saw it. It allowed him to act with precision when others relied on guesswork. The war continued across the mountains, but Finch remained steady. He would measure the wind. He would read the land. And when another ridge turned deadly, he would find the narrow moment of calm that changed the outcome again.